Greetings, traveler. I'm SnapJelly, and I hate bastard swords. I do. Well, okay, not really. I shouldn't really say that I hate bastard swords. What I hate mostly is how people describe bastard swords. Because if you don't know what a bastard sword is, most people will tell you that a bastard sword is a sword that is long enough for you to use it with two hands and short enough for you to use it with one hand. So it's the in-between, kind of in-between a long sword and an arming sword, and that is, I think, why so many people like the bastard sword so much, because then you don't have to choose, right? You shouldn't have to choose between a one-handed sword or a two-handed sword, because both swords have benefits, and you don't want to get rid of any benefits, so you just have a sword that could be used as both, right? You can use it with one-handed or with two-handed if you want. People, this is rubbish. It's absolute bullshit. And it's also, it's not really true if you think about it. I mean, it kind of makes sense that a sword has to be short enough for you to use with one hand, because at a certain point in length that a sword gets, it becomes unwieldy for you to use with one hand. Not too heavy per se, but just not very practical because it's too long. But a sword is never too short for you to use it with two. Like a dagger can be used with two hands. I mean, you can stab somebody like that, or you can stab somebody like this with two hands, right? And I've had people use this sword, an arming sword, a one-handed sword. Specifically, this sword borrowed it from me and had to use it with two hands just because they're short. It was a two-handed sword to them, where the only thing that could really force you in a way to use a sword specifically with one hand is if it has a restrictive grip, like this one. And then still you could technically use it like this, but that's not really that effective. But you could. So that doesn't really make all that much sense. Like if I want to use this sword, which is a one-handed sword, and I want to use it with two hands, all I have to do is just grab it like this, grab it by the pommel, and there you go. I can use it with two hands now. But all that aside, why don't I like bastard swords? Well, the thing is, I personally don't really ever use the term bastard sword except for when videos, because when you make videos about any kind of sword, there's always somebody, when you say longsword, who says, actually that looks more like a bastard sword, or when you say arming sword, actually that looks more like a bastard sword, or a hand-and-a-half sword. The thing is, when I use swords or talk about swords, to me, it's always either an arming sword or a longsword. Because that's the thing. If I were to have this sword with this blade length, which is an arming sword to me, but I make the grip longer so that it would allow easier usage for two hands, then does that all of a sudden make it a bastard sword, or does that make it an arming sword that has a grip that's too long? Because to me, that would still be an arming sword, just one with a very long grip. And now let's turn it around, alright? If I were to have a sword that reaches up to my armpit, that's longsword length, right? And all of a sudden we meet each other and you're a bit shorter than me. You come up to about my chin or something. Then that sword, that long sword, right, to you would come up to your chin or even higher, somewhere in your face. That's too long for you. The longsword is too long. So is that all of a sudden not a longsword because it's longer? Or is that a longsword that is too long for you? Because that's the thing, right? A longsword doesn't have a set length that it needs to be for it to be a longsword. So how can you make a bastard sword out of a longsword? Most people would say that a bastard sword is just a short version of a longsword, and that's where it kind of is in my mind as well. I would say that a bastard sword is kind of a subcategory of longsword, but that would make a bastard sword just a short longsword. And what's the real difference? You can swing a longsword around with one hand. You can use a longsword one-handedly. It's just not practical because it's too long. And if you have a bastard sword, then that sword is either going to be too long for you to practically use it with one hand, or it's a one-handed sword. So, well, that you could also use with two hands. But like I just said, you can always use a one-handed sword with two hands. Now, another scenario, right? This sword is a longsword. Synthetic sparring longsword. If I put this point on the ground, then it reaches up to underneath my boob, right? Just underneath my chest. That's how long it is. Now again, you show up. You're a bit shorter than me, and you get yourself also a sword that reaches to underneath your boob. That's long sword length. Okay, good. Now I were to use your sword, right? That reaches up to your boob, and you're shorter than me. That means to me it reaches up to about just above my belly button, let's say something like that. So this sword, it would lose a bit of its length, like this much. All of a sudden, you would have a sword like this with this blade length, right? Let's just tie something on there. to indicate the length. Right there. This piece would be gone, and this would be the length of your sword. Now, you could say that that's a bastard sword to me. It's a long sword to you, but I'm a bit taller, so that to me would be a bastard sword, because I could use this one-handed and two-handed. But I am here telling you that if I have a sword that has this blade length, I would use it with one hand. This is arming sword length. In fact, I bet that if I were to put the blades together, next to each other, like that, oh look at that! They're about the same length. The arming sword is even a bit longer, the blade on the arming sword. So, there's the thing. This is not a bastard sword. To me, it's an arming sword that has an incredibly long grip. So there it is. To you it would be a long sword. To anybody who's shorter than me it would be a long sword. And to me it would be an arming sword with a long grip. If saying that this would be a bastard sword, then what's the real difference between a bastard sword and an arming sword? It has a blade that's arming sword length. So is it the grip? Is it the grip that makes it a bastard sword all of a sudden? So a bastard sword is just an arming sword with a long grip then. See, it comes down to that again, because I would use a blade with this length with one hand, and all of this is just redundant. It's unnecessary, it gets in the way. I would want a sword that has this blade length to have the pommel stop right here. Just like that. So that if I want to, I can apply second hand, but I don't have to. And I mostly won't. So it's an arming sword. Just one with a very long grip. Now you could say, but, well, this is arming sword length for you, Jelly. But what if the blade is this long? Right in the middle. Would that be a bastard sword? It's not a long sword, but it's also not an arming sword. It's longer than your arming sword. Well, I would say that if the blade is this long, right here, then I personally would use it with two hands. It would be a bit short for a long sword, but I would use it with two hands. So does that make it a bastard sword? Yes, you could say that would make it a bastard sword, or you could say that it is a long sword that's just relatively short compared to others. So that's the thing. Bastard sword is a subcategory for longsword. And no matter how tall you are, your sword, if you're going to grab a sword, you are going to prefer either two-handed usage or one-handed usage based on the proportions of the sword, right? Compared to how tall you are. Saying that a sword is long enough for two-handed usage and short enough for one-handed usage, that doesn't mean anything, because any sword is that. You can swing a great sword around with one hand. It's not going to be very practical, but you can. Right? You can use a dagger with two hands. So, this whole concept that people have in their mind about the bastard sword being the middle way, you can use it, swing it both with one and with two, is just not really relevant. No matter what sword you grab, you are always going to prefer either using it with one or with two hands. Right? And if you prefer using it with one hand and it has an excessively long grip, then that's unnecessary. You might as well get rid of that and have it be an arming sword or a one-handed sword. And if you prefer using it with two, then it is pretty much just going to be a longsword, because a longsword isn't just two-handed usage. There's a lot of grappling in longsword, which you do by getting rid of one hand, right? Grappling with the left hand and then stabbing or cutting with the right, so you're swinging it with one hand. So again, does that all of a sudden make it a bastard sword? No. There's also one-handed stuff in longsword usage, even though it's a two-handed sword. So, what's the difference between a bastard sword, a longsword, and an arming sword? There is no real difference. Right? It all depends on you, on the person. The person wielding the sword, compared to his or her length, would use the sword either with one hand or with two hands. And that's it. Right? There is no real middle ground. This sword is, for me, a definite one-handed sword. I never use this sword two-handed, even if I have a second hand free. I mean, I could, but I don't, because I like grappling more, and I just use it with one hand, and I use my left hand for something else. I just have it behind my back, or wherever. I've had people use this sword specifically with two hands because they have to, just based on length. So what kind of sword is this? Is this a bastard sword? You can use it with two hands. You can. It's long enough for some people to use it with two hands. It's also short enough for me to use it with one. What is it then? See, that's why I don't like bastard sword. But it's not about bastard swords in general. I think it's mostly just about the term bastard swords and how people use the term bastard sword. I mean, thing is, the idea of you can use it with one or with two hands, that's such a spectator's perspective, I feel like. That's really what somebody who doesn't, practice sword fighting would say about this sword. But the thing that I don't understand is, and my apologies if this makes you angry, but I see a lot of reenactors and HEMA people and stuff say this as well. And I feel like, I get that not everybody is going to have such a hate for swords with excessively long grips, because if you've seen more of my videos, then you know that that's a personal pet peeve of mine. I hate it when swords have grips that are way longer than necessary. But not everybody's going to have that. But still, I would feel like if you practice sword fighting, you would, have this preference towards one-handed or two-handed usage. So I don't understand this whole idea that people had behind what made a bastard sword to them. Right? All you can really say about a bastard sword is that it's the in-between. So it's either a relatively long arming sword or a relatively short longsword. So either one of those. It's a subcategory. And people refer to things as bastard swords when they're one-handed swords that have incredibly long grips, or if they're long swords that are just a bit shorter than average. Well, me personally, and I'm not telling you that this is the definite definition of what a bastard sword is, but this is just the way that it works in my mind, right? To me, if I have a sword that's this length with a longer grip, to me that's an arming sword with a long grip, right? If I have a long sword that's a bit shorter than what you would see on average, then to me that's what I would call a bastard sword, kind of. But I would most likely usually just call it a longsword, because, well, that's what it is. You would use it as a longsword, so it is a longsword, pretty much. It's just a relatively short one. So yeah, face reveal at 1 million subs. And thank you for joining my quest, and I hope you'll join me in the next one. Bye, guys.